I was 14 years old when my family left me at Terminal 3 of O'Hare Airport. Not by accident, by decision. After a screaming fight on a family vacation, my parents walked through security and never looked back. I stood there for 3 hours before a pilot in uniform knelt down and asked me my name. He didn't just call the police. He flew me to my grandmother's house himself. That pilot, he didn't know he was saving the person who would one day run his airline. That pilot, Captain Marcus Webb, didn't just make a phone call. He canceled his deadhead flight, bought me a hot chocolate, and sat with me until my grandmother drove 6 hours through the night to Chicago. He never told me his full name. I had to search passenger manifests years later to find him. Here's what I need you to understand. That night at the gate, I wasn't just abandoned. I was erased. No one came looking. No missing person report. No apology. Just silence from the people who were supposed to protect me. The question nobody asks about stories like mine is this: what happens to a 14-year-old who realizes she has no safety net at all? The answer is she builds one. Out of scrap metal and stubbornness, and the quiet fury of being told she's nobody. This is not a story about a pilot's kindness. It's a story about what happens when you grow up knowing you can only count on yourself, and then you discover you were wrong. Let me take you back to before that airport terminal, to a house in Ridgemont, Illinois, where I learned what love was not. My parents were experts at the kind of absence that doesn't look like absence. My father, Greg, ran a small building supply store that was slowly bleeding money. He was there at dinner, but his mind was always on the next payment, the next loan, the next way to keep the house from slipping. My mother, Denise, filled the silence with schedules. Piano lessons, science fairs, dentist appointments. She kept the calendar full so nobody would notice there was nothing underneath. I had a younger sister, Kelsey, who was 3 years behind me. She was the easy one. The one who laughed when my father told a joke, who hugged my mother without being asked, who got the bigger bedroom and the new desk lamp and the quiet favorite status that nobody ever named out loud. I was the one who asked questions. Why do we have to sell Grandpa's tools? Why can't I take art class? Why do you look at me like I'm a problem you haven't solved yet? By the time I was 12, I had learned to make myself small. I stayed in my room. I did my homework without being reminded. I stopped asking. The summer before everything broke, my grandmother, Alina, invited me to stay with her in a small town called Maple Creek, 300 miles away. She lived in a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a garden that ran wild along the fence line. She didn't have much money, but she had space. Space for me to spread out my books. Space for me to talk without being interrupted. Space for me to exist. That summer, she taught me how to bake bread, how to identify birds by their calls, how to fix a leaky faucet with nothing but a wrench and patience. She never asked why I was quiet. She just let me be quiet next to her. One evening, sitting on the porch, she said something I didn't understand until years later. You have a hard road ahead, Iris, but hard roads don't mean wrong roads. They mean you're going somewhere most people won't go. I thought she was talking about high school. I went home at the end of August, and the distance between me and my parents felt wider than ever. My father's store was failing. My mother's smiles were tighter. The arguments started small, about chores, about grades, about the tone of my voice. But they escalated fast, like a fire catching dry grass. By the spring of my 14th year, the fights were about everything and nothing. My father started drinking more. My mother stopped defending me. Kelsey stayed in her room with her headphones on. The vacation was my mother's idea, a week in Florida. Family time, she said, like the word could glue us back together. We flew out of O'Hare on a Saturday morning. The tension was thick from the moment we parked the car. The argument started at baggage claim, something about which rental car to get. Then it moved to the hotel, then to the restaurant. By day 3, I was the target. You're always sulking. You think you're better than us. Why can't you just be normal? I don't remember what I said that finally broke it. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the wrong look at the wrong moment. We were at the terminal, waiting for the return flight. My father was yelling. My mother was crying. Kelsey was staring at the floor, and then my father stopped. He looked at me. You know what? Stay. If you're so unhappy, don't come home. He grabbed my mother's arm. Kelsey followed. They walked toward the security gate. I thought they'd stop. I thought it was a threat. I stood there for 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. No one came back. I sat down on a cold metal bench near gate 34. I watched families hug, couples argue, businessmen rush past. No one looked at me. I was invisible. I was 14 years old and I had been erased. 3 hours passed. The terminal got quieter. A janitor mopped the floor near the gate. I was staring at the scuff marks on the tile when a voice said, "You okay, kid?" I looked up. A man in a pilot's uniform, cap under his arm, graying temples, kind eyes. He looked at me the way my grandmother looked at me, like I mattered. His name was Marcus Webb. He was a captain for Midwest Air. His flight had been delayed, and he was waiting in the terminal like everyone else, but he noticed me. I told him my parents had left. He didn't panic. He didn't call security first. He knelt down so we were at eye level. "What's your grandmother's number?" I gave it to him. He called her from his personal phone. I heard him say, "I'll bring her to you if I have to." He did. He canceled his deadhead flight, bought me a hot chocolate, and sat with me for 4 hours until my grandmother arrived. She had driven 6 hours through the night. When she walked into the terminal, she didn't ask what I had done wrong. She just opened her arms. Captain Webb shook my hand before he left. "You're going to be okay," he said. "I can tell." I moved in with my grandmother 3 days later. She enrolled me at Maple Creek High School. I stopped being invisible. I started to breathe. But the questions I couldn't answer kept gnawing. Why did my parents never call? Why did no one come looking? And why did my grandmother, who lived on a fixed income and owned nothing but a farmhouse, look so calm when I asked her about the future? She had secrets, and the first one I uncovered would change everything. I was cleaning out her attic one Saturday afternoon, a year after the airport. Dusty boxes, old photo albums, a trunk with a broken lock. Inside the trunk, under a pile of quilts, I found a letter. Vintage envelope, no return address. Postmarked from Seattle, 19 years earlier. Inside was a single typed page. It was addressed to my grandmother, and it was signed by the founder of a company I had never heard of then. A company that would later become the airline I now run. The letter said, "Aliner, you were the best chief pilot we never promoted. If you ever change your mind, the cockpit door is always open." I read that letter 5 times that afternoon. My grandmother, the woman who baked bread and grew tomatoes and drove 6 hours to save me, had been a pilot, a chief pilot. She had walked away from it all before I was born. I went downstairs with the letter in my hand. She was at the kitchen table, shelling peas. She looked at my face, then at the paper. She didn't flinch. "Sit down," she said. "It's time you knew the rest." I thought the airport was the worst thing that would ever happen to me. I was wrong. What came next would force me to decide who I really was. I sat down at the kitchen table, the letter still trembling in my hand. My grandmother wiped her fingers on her apron, took the paper from me, and laid it flat. Then she told me a story I had never heard. Her name was Aliner Cross before she married. She learned to fly at 19, soloed at 20, earned her commercial license at 22. By 26, she was a chief pilot for a small regional carrier out of Seattle called Pacific Skyways. She flew DC-9s, then 727s, then early model 737s. She was one of the first women in that role in the entire Pacific Northwest. "For 12 years, that was my life," she said. "I loved every minute of it. The takeoffs, the landings, the quiet hours between stars. I loved being the one responsible." Then came February of 1989, a night flight from Portland to Seattle. She was scheduled to fly it, but her son, my father, came down with a high fever. She swapped shifts with another captain, a friend named Ray. She stayed home with her child. The flight never made it, a mechanical failure on approach. All 47 people on board died. Ray was among them. "I went to the funerals," she said. "I held Ray's wife. I watched his kids bury their father, and every single second I was thinking it should have been me." She stopped flying after that. She sold her house in Seattle, moved to the farmhouse in Maple Creek, and never talked about aviation again. She married a farmer, had 2 more children, and buried herself in a life that didn't require looking up. But I kept my license current, she said quietly. Every 2 years, I drove to a flight school in Peoria and did my medical and my check ride. I never told anyone, not your grandfather, not your parents. I did it because I couldn't let go completely. I stared at her. The woman who taught me to plant tomatoes had been a chief pilot. The woman who drove 6 hours to rescue me had been flying airplanes while my father was still in diapers. Why didn't you ever go back? I asked. Because going back meant facing the guilt, she said. But staying away meant abandoning the only thing that ever made me feel whole. I chose the guilt. It was easier. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the cockpit, about the stars, about the silence between clouds. I had never considered flying. I had spent my life looking down, trying to survive, but Alina had spent her life looking up, and she had taught me to look up too, even when I didn't realize it. The next morning, I found her in the barn. She was standing in front of an old tarp, pulled it back to reveal a wooden crate. Inside was a brand new flight computer, a headset, and a stack of textbooks. Jeppesen manuals, FAR AIM, a logbook with no entries. I was going to wait until you were 16, she said. But you found the letter, and I think you're ready. I started flight lessons that summer. The closest airport was a tiny strip called Maple Creek Municipal. One runway, no tower, a single hangar that smelled of oil and old coffee. My instructor was a retired Air Force Master Sergeant named Hank Kowalski. He looked me up and down and said, "You're Alina's girl." It wasn't a question. I soloed at 15, got my private license at 16, my instrument rating at 17. Every lesson was paid for by my grandmother, who never told me where the money came from. I assumed she had saved it over the years. I assumed wrong. During those years, my parents made no contact, no birthday cards, no phone calls. Kelsey sent me a Facebook message once, a simple "I miss you," and then nothing. I was erased from their lives as completely as if I had never existed. But I had a new family. Hank, the old mechanics at the airport, the dispatcher who let me sit in the tower and listen to radio calls, and Alina, who grew weaker each month but never missed a single one of my flights. The summer I turned 17, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. She gave me the news in the same flat voice she used to tell me the garden needed weeding. "I've had a good run," she said, "and I've got one more thing to tell you." She opened the bottom drawer of her dresser and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were stock certificates, hundreds of them. Pacific Skyways had been bought out by a larger airline, then merged again and again. The shares had split multiple times. The current value. Approximately $1.2 million, she said. I couldn't breathe. "I never touched them," she said. "I couldn't. They felt like blood money after Ray died, but I let them grow, and I kept them for you." "Why me?" "Because you're the only one who might understand," she said. "You were abandoned too, Iris, not in a crash but at a gate, and you survived. I need someone to carry what I couldn't." She died 6 weeks later. I was alone in the farmhouse, 17 years old with a pile of stock certificates and a pilot's license, and no idea what to do next. The state assigned me a guardian ad litem. I told them I wanted to live in the farmhouse, finish high school, and go to college. They agreed, provided I maintained grades and stayed out of trouble. I did more than that. I enrolled in an aviation program at a community college an hour away. I worked nights at a diner to pay for fuel. I flew every chance I got. At 18, I had my commercial license, my multi-engine rating, and an interview at a regional airline called Skylift Express. It was the direct descendant of Pacific Skyways, the same airline my grandmother had flown for, the same one whose crash had haunted her. I got the job, first officer on a turboprop flying mail routes. Night runs to small towns in Iowa and Nebraska. Pay was barely above minimum wage, but every time I pushed the throttles forward, I felt Alina sitting next to me. 2 years passed. I upgraded to captain at 21. I moved to a regional jet at 22. I was the youngest female captain in the company's history. I didn't tell anyone about my grandmother. I wanted to earn it on my own. Then, on a layover in Denver, I saw a name on the cruise schedule: Captain Marcus Webb. I stared at the screen for a long time. The pilot who found me at gate 34 was still flying. He was a captain on the 737 for the mainline carrier, the one that had bought out my regional. He was based in Denver. I sent him an email through the company directory. "You probably don't remember me, but you changed my life at O'Hare 14 years ago. I'm a captain now, and I'd like to thank you in person." He responded within an hour. "I remember you. I've wondered about you for years. Let's have coffee." We met at a diner near the airport. He was grayer, slower, but his eyes were the same. He looked at my uniform and smiled. "Told you you'd be okay," he said. I told him the whole story: Eleanor, the farmhouse, the stock certificates. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I had a feeling about you, but I didn't know the half of it." Then he told me something I had never considered. "Your grandmother's crash, the one she blamed herself for, it wasn't her fault. I looked it up years ago. The NTSB report cited a maintenance error. The flight was doomed from the moment it left the gate. Ray couldn't have saved it either." I sat in silence. All those years of guilt, all those years of hiding, and she had been carrying a weight that was never hers to bear. "Does it matter now?" I asked. "It matters," he said, "because you're still carrying her guilt, and you don't have to." That conversation changed me. I started digging into my grandmother's history. I requested her old personnel file from the airline. I found letters of commendation from passengers, from crew, from the CEO himself. She was legendary, and she had walked away from all of it because of one misdiagnosed cause. I decided then that I would not let her story end in silence. I would make sure her name was known. But the airline had other plans for me. A merger was coming. The regional was being absorbed into the mainline carrier. Pilots were being furloughed. I was young, low on seniority, and vulnerable. 1 week before the merger closed, I received a letter from a law firm in Chicago. It was a thick envelope, certified mail. I opened it in my apartment alone. The letter said that Eleanor Cross had established a trust in my name when I was 14, the week after she brought me home from the airport. The trust held not only the stock certificates, but also a significant block of shares acquired through a proprietary agreement with the airline's founder. Total voting power, 12%, enough to influence board decisions. But there was a condition. I had to be actively employed by the airline in a flight operations role at the time of the merger's closing. If I was furloughed, the trust would dissolve and the shares would be donated to charity. The closing date was 30 days away, and I had just received a furlough notice effective in 21 days. My window was exactly 9 days. 9 days to save not just my career, but my grandmother's legacy. 9 days. I had 9 days to prevent my own furlough and unlock the trust that held my grandmother's legacy. The merger was a machine, and I was a piece of grit in its gears. My furlough notice was already processed. My name was on a list. The union told me there was nothing I could do. I called the law firm that had sent the trust letter. A young associate named David Chen picked up. I explained my situation. He was quiet for a long moment. "The trust language is specific," he said. "Actively employed in a flight operations role at the time of the merger's closing. If you're furloughed before that date, you don't qualify, but if you can get reinstated, even for 1 day, the condition would be met." Reinstated, in 9 days, against a corporate merger that had already budgeted for my termination. I asked David what my options were. "You need someone high enough to override the furlough list. A vice president of flight operations, maybe, or a director. Someone with authority to pull a name." I didn't know anyone at that level. I was a regional captain, low on the seniority list, invisible to the executives who were carving up the airline like a Christmas turkey. But I had one card I hadn't played: Captain Marcus Webb. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was the chief pilot for the 737 fleet at the mainline carrier. He sat in meetings with the people who made these decisions. I called him that night. He answered on the first ring. I told him everything. The trust, the 9-day window, the furlough notice. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I know someone. The VP of Flight Ops, a woman named Patricia Harmon. She started as a flight attendant, worked her way up. She's tough, but she's fair. And she has a soft spot for stories like yours." He gave me her email. I wrote to her that night. I told her about my grandmother, the trust, the deadline. I didn't plead. I laid out the facts. I asked for a meeting. She responded the next morning. "Come to my office in Chicago tomorrow at 10 a.m. I flew to Chicago that evening. I didn't sleep. I rehearsed my pitch over and over in my head. At 9:55, I walked into the executive offices at O'Hare. The same airport where I had been abandoned 11 years earlier. The same Terminal 3. The same gate area I had walked past to get to the elevator. Patricia Harmon's office was on the 14th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runways. She was in her late 50s, silver hair, no-nonsense posture. She shook my hand and gestured to a chair. "I read your email," she said. "That's quite a story." "I can verify every detail," I said. "My grandmother's personnel file is still on record. The trust documents are filed in Cook County. Captain Webb can confirm." She leaned back. "I don't doubt you, but I have a problem. The furlough list was approved by legal and HR. Pulling a name requires a business justification that doesn't expose the company to litigation from every other pilot on that list. What would justify it?" She looked at me for a long moment. "If you had a skill or qualification that the merged company critically needs, something unique, something that makes you more valuable than the cost of the exception." I thought about my logbook, night mail routes, single pilot operations in marginal weather, check airman designation, but none of that was unique. Then I remembered the flight computer, the one Alina had given me, and the logbook with no entries. She had left me one more gift. I opened my bag and pulled out a worn leather binder. Inside was my grandmother's original flight log from her Pacific Skyways days, her check ride signatures, her type ratings, her endorsements. At the back in her handwriting was a note, "To my granddaughter who will finish what I started." I handed it to Patricia. She flipped through it slowly. Her expression changed. "Alina Cross," she said. "I knew that name. She was one of the reasons I wanted to fly. I read about her in a magazine when I was a teenager." "She trained me," I said. "Not formally, but she taught me everything that matters. I have her logbook. I have her flight computer. I have her philosophy. And I have a trust that controls 12% of this company's voting shares. If I lose my job, those shares go to charity. That means the board loses a sympathetic shareholder, and you lose a pilot who was trained by a legend." Patricia closed the logbook. "I need to make some calls." She made them while I waited in the conference room. Through the glass wall, I watched her talk on the phone, gesture, type on her keyboard. The minutes stretched. At 11:47, she walked into the conference room. "I've authorized a 1-week contract extension for your current position, effective immediately. That keeps you employed past the merger closing date. The furlough won't take effect until after the extension expires. You'll meet the trust condition." I felt the air leave my lungs. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I need to ask you something. When the trust activates, you'll have 12% voting power. That makes you a significant independent shareholder. The board is going to want to meet you. Are you ready for that?" I had never thought about what the trust meant beyond saving my job. 12%. That wasn't just a safety net. That was leverage. "I'll be ready," I said. The merger closed on schedule. My contract extension held. The trust activated. I received a letter from the law firm confirming that the shares were now under my control. I was 23 years old, a regional jet captain, and one of the largest individual shareholders in an airline with over 200 aircraft. But with that power came attention. The board requested a meeting. I flew to headquarters in Atlanta. I wore my uniform. I carried my grandmother's logbook. The boardroom was all dark wood and leather chairs, 12 people around a table. The CEO, a man named Harold Vance, sat at the head. He looked at me like I was a curiosity. "Miss Cross," he said, You've inherited a significant position. We'd like to understand your intentions." I had prepared for this. "My grandmother was a pilot for this company's predecessor," I said. "She was forced out by circumstances beyond her control. I intend to honor her legacy by ensuring that this airline remembers where it came from. That includes maintaining a focus on safety, on pilot training, and on the values that made this company great." Harold Vance smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Those are noble sentiments, but voting shares come with responsibilities. We'll be watching your decisions closely." I nodded. "I'll be watching yours too." The meeting ended. I walked out of the boardroom with my hands shaking. I had just stared down the CEO of an airline, and I had survived. Over the next 2 years, I learned the game. I attended shareholder meetings. I voted my shares. I built relationships with other independent board members. I kept flying, upgrading to the 737, then to the 787. I became a check airman, training new hires and recurrents. My grandmother's story became known. I gave an interview to a trade publication about her legacy. It was picked up by a national news outlet. The headline read, "The pilot who never stopped flying." And then, in my 3rd year as a shareholder, the airline hit turbulence, a string of maintenance incidents, a near accident that made national headlines. The stock dropped 40%. The board called an emergency meeting. Harold Vance was under pressure. His leadership was being questioned. Some board members wanted him out, others defended him. The vote was split. I held the swing shares. Patricia Harmon called me the night before the vote. "Iris, I know this is a lot, but you need to decide. Do you back Vance or do you push for change?" I thought about Alina, about the letter from the founder, about the crash that wasn't her fault, about the guilt she carried for 40 years. "I need to see the maintenance reports," I said. "All of them, the full internal investigation." Patricia sent them over. I read through them that night. What I found made my blood run cold. The near accident wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a systemic failure. Cost-cutting measures had reduced maintenance intervals. Training hours had been slashed. Pilots were being pressured to fly with known discrepancies. The culture that Alina had helped build was being dismantled for quarterly earnings. I made my decision. At the board meeting the next morning, I stood up before the vote. "Mr. Vance, I've reviewed the internal maintenance reports. The near accident was preventable. It was the result of decisions made at this table to prioritize profit over safety. My grandmother died believing she was responsible for a crash that wasn't her fault. I will not let her legacy be tarnished by a board that repeats the same mistakes." I voted against Vance. The motion to remove him passed by 1 vote, my vote. The room was silent. Harold Vance gathered his papers and walked out without a word. The new CEO was appointed a week later, a woman named Sarah Okonkwo, former chief safety officer. She had a reputation for transparency and integrity. She called me on her first day. "Iris, I want to thank you, and I want to offer you a position, Director of Flight Operations. You'll oversee training and safety for the entire fleet. You'll report directly to me." I accepted. I kept flying part-time, but my main role was now in the corporate offices. I was 26 years old. I had gone from abandoned teenager to Director of Flight Operations at the same airline where my grandmother had been chief pilot. But the story didn't end there, because the job came with a revelation I never expected. The day I moved into my new office, I found a file in the bottom drawer of the desk. It was marked Confidential Personnel Alina Cross. Inside were documents from 40 years ago, not just her commendations, but a letter she had written to the CEO at the time, detailing safety concerns about the very maintenance practices that later caused the crash. She had tried to stop it, and they had buried her concerns. They had pushed her out and then let the accident happen and let her believe it was her fault. I sat in my new office, holding that letter, and cried. Not for myself, for her. For the 40 years she spent carrying a guilt that belonged to corporate officers who had chosen profit over lives. I had inherited her stock, but I had also inherited her mission, and I was just getting started. The airline was changing. But the people who had covered up her report were still in positions of influence. Some had retired. Some had moved to other companies. But one name kept appearing in the old files: a former vice president of maintenance who now sat on the board of a major supplier. A supplier that the airline was about to sign a $100 million contract with. I needed to decide how far I was willing to go to finish what my grandmother started. The name in the file was Robert Crane, former vice president of maintenance, the same man who had received my grandmother's safety letter 40 years ago and buried it. The same man who had signed off on the cost-cutting measures that led to the crash she blamed herself for. He was now chairman of the board at Aeroserve, the supplier bidding on a $100 million maintenance contract with our airline. I sat in my office, the old file open on my desk, Alina's handwriting staring up at me. She had written the letter in 1989, 3 months before the crash. She had documented specific maintenance shortcuts, falsified inspection records, and pressured mechanics to sign off on work they hadn't done. Robert Crane had initialed the memo that dismissed her concerns as overzealous. I had a choice. I could use this information to block the contract and expose Crane. Or I could stay quiet and let the deal go through, preserving my position and avoiding a fight that could cost me everything I had built. I thought about what Alina said to me on the porch that summer. Hard roads don't mean wrong roads. They mean you're going somewhere most people won't go. I scheduled a meeting with Sarah Okonkwo, the new CEO. I brought the file. She read it in silence, her expression unreadable. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "From a desk drawer in my office. It was left there, deliberately or not, 40 years ago. It documents a pattern of negligence that caused a crash, and the man responsible is about to sign a contract with us." Sarah closed the file. "Robert Crane has been a supplier to this airline for 3 decades. He has friends on the board. Blocking this contract will create enemies." "I know." She looked at me. "Do you have proof that Crane personally suppressed the safety report?" I had the memo with his initials, but I also had something else. A phone number in the margin of my grandmother's letter, a name I had never called. I dialed it that afternoon. A woman answered. Her name was Diane Crowley. She had been Robert Crane's administrative assistant in 1989. She was retired now, living in Arizona. "I've been waiting for someone to call," she said. "I kept copies." She sent me a box of documents. Internal memos, meeting notes, a handwritten apology from Crane to the CEO after the crash, admitting he had mishandled the cross situation. The apology had never been made public. The CEO had kept it in a personal file. I presented the full evidence to the board in a closed session. Robert Crane was invited to respond. He didn't show. Instead, his lawyer sent a letter denying everything. But the board voted to suspend the contract. The story was leaked to the press. The headline read, "Airline Supplier Chairman Linked to 1989 Cover-Up." Robert Crane resigned from Aeroserve within the week. The NTSB reopened the cold case into the 1989 crash, this time with the suppressed documents as evidence. I was called to testify. I sat in a federal building in Seattle, 40 years after my grandmother's flight, and read her letter aloud into the record. The investigator asked me why I had come forward. "Because she couldn't," I said. "She spent her life believing she was responsible. The people who actually caused it let her carry that weight. I'm here to set it down." The final report, released 18 months later, concluded that the crash had been caused by a combination of maintenance failures and management pressure. Pilot error was ruled out. My grandmother was exonerated. I flew to Maple Creek on the day the report was published. I walked into the farmhouse, now empty, and sat at the kitchen table. I opened the drawer where she kept her recipe cards. Tucked behind them was a photograph I had never seen. Alina in her uniform, standing next to a DC-9, smiling. On the back, in pencil, "First day as chief pilot. Never been happier." I framed that photo and hung it in my office at the airline headquarters. Beneath it, I placed her logbook. Over the next 2 years, I transformed the flight operations department. We increased training hours by 40%. We implemented a confidential safety reporting system. We hired more maintenance inspectors. I flew line trips every month to stay connected to the reality of the job. Pilots started calling me by my first name. At 28, I was promoted to vice president of flight operations. At 30, senior vice president. And at 32, the board asked me to consider the role of chief operating officer. I said yes. I was the youngest COO in the airline's history. I still flew. I still carried a Leaner's flight computer in my bag. I still remembered the feeling of cold metal benches and empty terminals. The surprising detail came 6 months into the COO role. My assistant handed me a letter, handwritten, postmarked from a small town in Oregon. I opened it. The handwriting was shaky, elderly. "Dear Iris, you don't know me. My name is Ray Kowalski. I was the navigator on the flight your grandmother swapped out of the night of the crash. I survived because I had the flu and stayed home. I've carried the guilt of that for 40 years. I read about you. I read the report. I just wanted to say thank you. You gave my old friend Alina the peace she deserved. And you gave me permission to stop blaming myself too. Fly safe, kid." I set the letter down. I thought about the chain of events, the flight swap, the fever, the crash, the guilt that ricocheted through decades and touched people I had never met. Alina's guilt, Ray's guilt, my own guilt about surviving my parents' abandonment, all of it looping back to that single February night. I wrote back to Ray. I told him he was allowed to be alive. I told him Alina would have wanted him to fly again. I told him the airline had a tradition of inviting survivors and family members to ride in the jump seat on anniversary flights. I asked if he'd like to come. He did. On the 40th anniversary of the crash, I flew a 787 from Seattle to Portland with Ray Kowalski in the jump seat. He was 83 years old. He cried during takeoff. So did I. At the gate in Portland, a woman approached me. She was in her late 60s, holding a photograph. "You're Iris Cross?" she asked. "Yes." "I'm Rachel Webb, Marcus Webb's daughter." I felt the ground shift. Marcus Webb, the pilot who found me at gate 34, had died 3 years earlier. Lung cancer. I had spoken at his funeral. Rachel handed me an envelope. "My father asked me to give this to you if I ever met you." I opened it inside. A single page typed. It was a letter of recommendation dated the week after he found me at the airport, addressed to the hearing committee of a regional airline. It began, "I met a young woman today who will one day run this industry. Her name is Iris T-Main. She doesn't know it yet, but I do. Hire her, train her, and watch her fly." He had written it 30 minutes after he left me with my grandmother. He had never sent it. He kept it in his desk for 18 years. I folded the letter and placed it next to Alina's photograph. 2 people who saw me before I saw myself. A pilot and a grandmother, both gone, both still flying with me. The next week, I was offered the role of Chief Executive Officer. I accepted. At 33, I became the CEO of the airline that had once abandoned me at a gate, that had once buried my grandmother's truth, that had once been run by the men who let her carry a crash that wasn't hers. My first official act as CEO was to rename the training center, the Alina Cross Flight Operations Center. I cut the ribbon myself, wearing my grandmother's wings pinned to my blazer. After the ceremony, I walked to gate 34 in Terminal 3 at O'Hare. I stood where I had stood at 14. The tile had been replaced. The benches were different. The airline logos had changed 3 times, but the light was the same. The fluorescent buzz was the same. I sat down on a bench and let myself feel it. The fear, the cold, the waiting. And then the voice that said, "You okay, kid?" I wasn't that kid anymore, but she was still inside me, and she deserved to know that the story didn't end at the gate. I get asked a lot how I did it, how a 14-year-old abandoned at an airport terminal became the CEO of the airline that left her behind. People want a formula, a secret, a single moment when everything clicked. There isn't one. There was a pilot who knelt down, a grandmother who drove through the night, a letter in an attic, a logbook with no entries, a desk drawer with a buried file, a chain of small, invisible decisions made by people who refused to look away. the real story isn't about me. It's about Alina Cross, who flew for 12 years and then spent 40 more carrying a crash that wasn't hers. It's about Marcus Webb, who stopped at a cold bench and saw a kid who needed someone to notice. It's about Ray Kowalski, who survived the flu and 40 years of guilt before he finally sat in a jump seat again. I was the vessel, they were the current. Here's what I've learned. The people who hurt you don't get to define you. The people who save you don't get to carry you forever. At some point, you have to become the person who kneels down for the next kid on a cold bench. That's the part nobody tells you about survival. It's not a destination. It's a responsibility. You don't get to the top and stop. You turn around and reach back. I think about my parents sometimes, not with anger anymore, with something closer to understanding. They were drowning in their own choices. They couldn't see me because they couldn't see past themselves. I don't forgive them, but I don't carry them either. I set that weight down on a bench at gate 34 and walked away. The airline runs differently now. Training isn't a budget line to be cut. Safety isn't a checkbox. The maintenance reports go straight to my desk, and I read every single one. Not because I don't trust the system, because Alina taught me that systems fail when people stop paying attention. If you're listening to this, and you're sitting on a cold bench somewhere, figuratively or literally, I want you to hear this. You are not invisible. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a story that hasn't finished being written yet. And the people who are supposed to see you will see you. Sometimes they show up in a pilot's uniform. Sometimes they show up as a grandmother who never stopped flying. Sometimes they show up as the person you become when you finally decide that you matter. I still fly. Every month I take a trip in the left seat. I file my own flight plan. I talk to the tower. I land on the same runways Alina landed on. On my desk at headquarters, I keep two things: a photograph of her standing next to a DC-9 and a letter Marcus Webb wrote but never sent. They remind me where I came from, and they remind me that the cockpit door is always open. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to follow where this road goes next. And if you ever find yourself alone in a terminal, look for the person who stops. They might just change everything. I'm Iris T. Main. I run the airline, and I still remember the sound of a pilot's voice asking if I was okay.